today's video we are going to be talking about things that make Ukraine poor, things that hold Ukraine back. And we're not going to be talking about small things. We are going to be talking about, in my opinion, fundamental things, big things that are responsible for keeping this really cool and great Eastern European country behind. Okay? And this has been as a result of my experience living in Ukraine, traveling all over the world, seeing how other countries live, growing up in the United States. So I have a good frame of reference, I feel. Anyway, let's get started. So the first thing that keeps Ukraine poor is infrastructure. Okay? What is infrastructure? Infrastructure is roads. It's how things are built, bridges. It's houses, right? Residential buildings, apartment buildings. It's commercial property. Everything is infrastructure. And honestly, when I first came to Ukraine, I wasn't really paying attention to it too much. Okay, so, a couple of streets, they have potholes. A couple of streets that don't have, a sidewalk. It is Eastern Europe, right? What are you going to do? But throughout the years, I realized that in Ukraine, the infrastructure is of very, very low quality. It's very, very poor. And just in the last few years, I started noticing it more and more. And so what do I mean? Okay, well, take roads, for instance. Roads in Ukraine are one of the worst roads in the world. There's a ranking somewhere out there, and Ukraine is ranked, I believe, like a couple of places from the bottom, right? So it's ranked somewhere alongside a couple of African countries or a couple of other countries. It's nowhere that a European or even an Eastern European country should be. And this is a huge problem, because if you want to travel around Ukraine, you have to make sure that the road you're going to be taking to your destination is actually functioning, is actually a good road. Now, granted, the major cities, for the most part, have really good roads, at least in the last couple of years. But if you want to go off the beaten path, you want to visit a small village, you want to visit, a small town, you want to go somewhere new, you want to go somewhere interesting, you got to do your homework, because I learned it the hard way. There's some really, really terrible roads where you're driving and you're thinking, should I go back? Should I go by the fields? So it could be pretty bad. Granted, they are improving in the last couple of years. Things have been improving, but that's only a part of the picture. The next thing is really everything else, like how they build buildings, shopping centers, sidewalks, everything. It's all kind of an afterthought, right? There, here in Kiev, where I am in Kiev, the capital, the biggest city in Ukraine, the richest city in Ukraine. There's maybe, one or two really functioning, really good shopping centers. The rest of them are kind of as an afterthought, right? They're kind of built, it's hard to find exits. It's a mess. It's dark. It's low quality. You're walking along a shopping center and it's open, it's functioning, and some parts are not finished, some parts are not completed. The same thing could be said, for just about anything. Sidewalks, parks. There's a lot of abandoned buildings here in Ukraine, in the middle of Kiev, right? There's on the outskirts, okay, I understand that. But in the middle of Kiev, there's like there's more. A bunch of abandoned buildings that really nobody knows what to do with, or nobody has any motivation of doing something. I mean, can you imagine something like this in London? Can you imagine something like this in New York City, where I grew up? Can you imagine something like this in any big European city? No, absolutely not. And really, this is kind of how everything is. The infrastructure, how they build, how they attempt to build, is very, very poor quality, right? When you take everything together, it's almost like it's an afterthought. It's almost like, well, when the businesses come in, they make their money. When the government makes their money, that the infrastructure is like, all right, maybe we should finish this road or something like this. It's really, really bad. And US has great infrastructure. We all know that. Western countries have great infrastructures. Poland has great infrastructure. The Baltic countries, Latvia, where me and Marina visited recently, have great infrastructure. But one of my biggest surprises is when we went to Turkey, which is not the richest country in the world, not the poorest, kind of middle level. They have awesome infrastructure. Turks really know how to build their cities, build malls, build everything. I was amazed. I was really, really blown away. And this is completely not the case here in Ukraine, unfortunately. Next thing I want to talk about is the overall mindset of the people. And this is very, very interesting. Obviously, I'm not speaking about everybody. I know there's, different groups of people. But what I'm referring to is kind of my experience just living in Ukraine, right? Boots on the ground, seeing people, seeing how they react, going to different stores, going to different co-working places, talking to various people where I live. And the overall mindset of the general population, I would categorize as indifferent, right? Indifference is a good word. Another good word is apathy, right? They're not, for the most part, right? They are not too focused on improving this country. They're not focused on, making this place better, getting it a couple of steps, fixing something for the most part, right? And I can tell you many, many examples. One interesting example that happened just recently, actually, was I was walking home and I met my neighbors that live on the same floor as I am. And unfortunately, on that floor, there's no light, but there's a light bulb that's above my neighbor's apartment. And I was like, is that your light bulb? I mean, can we just replace it? It would be nice to have some light. Things like that, right? Because I want some light when I come home at night. It's fall right now. The days are going to be shorter. The nights are going to be longer. And the guy, who's like a young guy, like 30 years old, 35 years old maybe, just said like, who cares? That was his mindset. He said it in Russian, obviously, but it can be described as, who cares? Like, who knows? Something like this. And I was like shocked, man. I mean, like, he has the light bulb. He has the whole thing there. All he has to do is just change the bulb, and that's it. But this was a feeling of indifference. And this indifference is prevalent among all groups here, right? The older generation, right? I'm talking about 50, 60 plus. They are indifferent because they're nostalgic about, Soviet Union, right? A lot of them are like, it was better back then. We all know that. There's really no need to kind of dig into that. The younger generation is indifferent because they understand that, things are not as great, and they feel like they can't make any difference. And a lot of them want to leave. And so those who can't leave to go to the US, Germany, Europe, etc., they're indifferent because they're living here. Everybody's indifferent. They're indifferent. That's the whole mindset. And this is pretty interesting, right? Because I would have figured like Ukraine is a much more innovative, much more dynamic society, but that is not the case at all. Now, granted, there are some people out there that are very, very entrepreneurial. I mean, let's not forget that there's a lot of very, very smart people here. IT, there's IT's developed here, right? There's American companies and other Western companies are, getting their Ukrainian offices for the IT talent here, right? There's a lot of smart people. But when I'm talking about the general population, when I'm talking about in the center, outside the center, people for the most part are very indifferent. This is night and day compared to a place like United States, where everybody, or at least like almost everybody, is always trying to improve things. They're trying to evolve. They're trying to fix something, get a new process, improve. And this is not just the US. The Baltic countries, they're not indifferent. They want to, join the EU. They want to improve their life. They want to go somewhere, right? We went to Armenia in May. some months ago, and Armenians, very innovative, very entrepreneurial, very, very proud of their country, which I really, really liked. And that's just not something I felt here in Ukraine. It's people are kind of like whatever, right? They're kind of like blah blah, that kind of mindset. This is what I felt as compared to some of the other places where I've been. The next point I want to talk about, and this is a very, very important point, is something that I call lack of private property mindset. And let me try to kind of expand on that a little bit. Here in Ukraine, a lot of people, they own their property. And a lot of people also have this mindset that they're owed something by others. So, certain generation, they feel that, apartments are theirs because they worked all their lives during the Soviet times. And I can understand that. It's logical, you worked, you got an apartment. But what that has created is this kind of point that's kind of connected to the previous point. It's this lack of improving, lack of drive. Because, for instance, like I grew up in New York City. In New York City, if you don't work, if you don't hustle, you don't get to eat. It's very, very simple. Everybody's paying, $2,000 a month, $3,000 a month just on the apartment, right? So you got to make more money than that in order to have a really good lifestyle. And that is what I grew up with. That is my understanding of how life should be. And I totally agree with that, right? You got to work. You got to work to enjoy life. But here in Ukraine, it's kind of like the opposite, because for the most part, if people are local, if a person was born in Kiev, even if they weren't, right, they might have, parents, maybe their parents were born, or they might have an apartment somewhere else. But if they were born in Kiev, they probably own their apartment. So that means like a big chunk of monthly income is taken care of. And this is across with everybody, right? The older people own apartments and they don't really need to work, at least they don't need to work as hard. Right, like the other day I went to a place where you get something stitched up. So I had like a little bag, it needed to be stitched up, fixed. In New York City, I can go and I can get it fixed at any place, and they're gonna fix it for me. In Brooklyn, Manhattan, anywhere in the United States. But I went to this place, and this lady did a job for me before, but she looked at my bag and she refused to do the job because it would involve a lot of work. And I was shocked. I was like, what? You're not accepting this bag. You're not taking on the job? I said, I'll double whatever your regular pay is. And she's like, nah, I don't want to work in it. It's just too complicated. She's like, come back when you have something easy, right? Something very, very simple. And really, I was blown away. I was telling everybody about it because, wait a second, you got a customer, but you're not willing to do it. And what I noticed over time is that a lot of people are more or less like this. Like, if it's a hard job, if they gotta go above and beyond something, if they gotta get out of their comfort zone, they're probably gonna decline. They're gonna say no. Obviously not everybody. There's probably some very entrepreneurial people. But that has been crazy that people are like this, because what I learned in business is that if somebody comes in, they want to pay for something, you have a customer waiting, you gotta take their money and do whatever they want. But here it's a little bit different. That is because they own an apartment, they own maybe something else, maybe they own a car, and they're good, right? They're good. And this is across spectrums. With older people, older generation, right, 50, 60 plus, 60 plus even, they have an apartment, right? A little bit younger than that, they probably have an apartment. Maybe they have their parents giving them some money. Maybe they have their parents' apartment. And this works down that way, right? The younger people, they feel like, their parents owe them, to do things for them. And I've seen this in a lot of places, right? So this is like the complete opposite of this kind of New York hustler mentality where everybody's working so that they can afford to live and have a good life. And this is something I realized, definitely this is a consequence of Soviet Union, it's a consequence of people having free apartments, it's a consequence of the fact that you don't really, earn it, right? Because a lot of young people, right, they get their parents' apartments. Very, very common here. And so, if they get an apartment, that apartment is 100 grand, 50 grand, 100 grand, 150 grand, maybe even 200 grand, maybe even more. They don't really feel like they earned it, right? So they don't value it as much. And I call this kind of the private property mindset, because for the long time here during Soviet Union, there was no private property, right? Everything was owned by the state, quote unquote. And, if you worked, you had connections, you would get a nice apartment. If you didn't have connections, you would get another apartment. But everybody had an apartment, right, of different levels. And actually, this was a very, very important point, like back during the Cold War, with the whole discussion, right, planned economies versus market economies. And I think it was Margaret Thatcher or somebody else, I can't remember now, during that time, that said something like, you got to give people, you got to make sure they own their houses. You got to make sure that they get to own their private properties. And if they do, they are going to value that place a lot more. They're going to value that private property, and they're going to fight for private property rights, right? And this was kind of the argument why, market economies, capitalism is a better system than socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it. And so this is a huge, huge thing. And unfortunately, I feel that the fact that they had all these like free or, they had to pay a little bit more, these apartments, really skewed their thinking. In fact, they don't really feel that they need to go out and conquer the world, at least most of the people here. And this is another reason why it keeps things poor, because, that business owner that I went to, she didn't want to do it. And that means, a lot of people are like this, and that means people are not progressing or not developing. So that's a very, very important point. Now, the next point I want to talk about is something that has to do with corruption, and that is what I call the finding a loophole mindset. And I'm going to expand on that in a little bit. Now, as you know, or you don't know, corruption is a big thing here in Ukraine. And in my view, corruption is really the lack of effectiveness. When things are not effective, when things are not efficient, the flip side is corruption. Things are very, very efficient. Things are very, very effective. Everything is done how it's supposed to be done. There's not going to be any need for corruption. But when things are not moving, when you have a big bureaucracy, etc., that's how corruption naturally develops. Now, there is corruption here in Ukraine. There's a lot of corruption. It's getting better. But the biggest problem that I see is the mindset of the people. And that's the mindset is something that I call finding a loophole mindset. And a lot of people here are like this, if not, the majority. And the idea is, if you want to get something done, a lot of times people are going to find a way to do it kind of in the gray area, right? There's the legal way, there's the illegal way, and then there's the gray area. And a lot of people here are going after the gray area. Now, of course, I'm not saying everybody. There's obviously very fair people, there's very, very honest people. There's a lot of honest people here, don't get me wrong. But in Eastern Europe, the way to think about doing things, and this could be applied to honest people, dishonest people, everybody, is kind of going along the gray area. Like, how can we do something and get away with it that may not be 100% legal, but, if we get caught, okay, we'll pay a small fine, or we'll get a slap on the wrist. But, nothing really bad is going to happen. So instead of going the right way, the legal way, we just go along the gray area, because the repercussions, the punishment is not going to be very, very severe. And this has to do with the next point that I'm going to mention in a second. And this is kind of an issue, because this is kind of everything, right? Because when you think about US, for the most part, Americans are very honest and very fair. right? They're very honest, they're very fair, they're hardworking, and they want to do things the right way. Their moral compass is in the right place, and a lot of Western countries are very, very similar to, in varying degrees. And that creates a very good society, right? That creates a society where everybody is held accountable to everybody else, right? So if you're working in a company or you're in the government somewhere in some kind of an agency, and you do something wrong, you will be held accountable to your actions by others, right? They're gonna go to their superior. Hopefully the superior is gonna take some action. They're not gonna cover it up. Well, of course, cover-ups happen from time to time, but for the most part, they happen a lot less in a place like United States than in a place like Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, there's going to be a lot of cover-ups, right? There's going to be people doing it the right way. They're going to try to get out. They're going to, get something out of it. And this is obviously a bad mindset. But yeah, on the other hand, I can't really blame the people for it, because the people here are awesome. They're really great, hardworking people. But the system is created so they can't really go the right way. They have to find a gray area, because if they go the right way, if they go the legal way, the 100% legal way, they're not gonna get where they want to get. It's just gonna take a lot of time. It's just gonna be a lot of pain. And as a result, a lot of people go in this area. Now, what I don't like is when a lot of Eastern Europeans, they go to a place like Denmark, and I lived in Denmark for a couple of years. They go to a place like United States. They go to a place like the Baltic countries, where people typically almost always take the legal way, no gray areas there. And they try to introduce their little schemes. Right here in Ukraine and in Russia, we call it schema. Different schemes into their thing, right? They want to, figure something out. They want to, maybe not show all of their money to pay taxes. They want to do something that's not 100% legal. And that's what annoys the hell out of me, especially when I lived in Denmark. You have these Eastern Europeans come in, they want to cheat the system, and I'm like, you're coming to a country that has evolved over the years to be effective, efficient, with minimal or almost no corruption, and you're introducing it. So that's what annoys me. Here in Ukraine, there's really no other way. But when you go abroad, you don't really need to have these schemes and try to cheat anybody, because everything is fair, everything is very, very effective. But that is kind of the situation here, is that a lot of people have this mentality, and sometimes it's really hard to break those habits, right? It's hard to forget, where you're coming from. And so and not only that, but also in Ukraine, this is a problem, because if everybody's thinking that way, if everybody's trying to cover up things for other people instead of, doing it the right way, going to the government, explaining things, there's no progress, right? There's no progression, there's no positivity. And unfortunately, I don't really see a solution to this. That's just how it is. It's how it has been before. It's still how it is now. And it's gonna be something serious, something drastic for this to kind of change and go away. Now, last but not least, I think this is one of the most important points, and it kind of connects to everything else, and that is the government. In my view, in my opinion, having been here, having traveled, the government here is very, very weak. There's really little or no enforcement to a lot of things. People can kind of do what they want. There's, not a lot of severe punishment if you do something, and that is why people, they can kind of drive fast if they want. They can park anywhere they want. They can park in the sidewalks. They can, do other things. And they know for the most part they're not going to be accountable for it. And this applies to regular day-to-day things involving like police. But it also applies on higher levels, right? We're talking about corruption in higher levels, right? Like bringing a lot of contraband, from other countries, bringing a lot of iPhones, doing all of these things. This applies on many, many levels. And this is very, very important, because if you think about, like United States, right, for the most part, probably not everybody, Americans, they trust the FBI, right? They trust the FBI. You know, I'm not saying everybody, but for the most part, the majority does. They trust more or less their government to you know, with a high certainty, right? Above 50%, above 70%, maybe not 100%. But here in Ukraine, the trust is very, very low, extremely low. And that is justifiable, because the government here really does not really do anything, right? Like Ukraine had an opportunity right after the collapse of Soviet Union to become like one of the Baltic countries. It was one of the richest countries in the Soviet Union, if not the richest, maybe after Russia, or at least one of the richest. Now, you know, they had a chance to throw out all of these, you know, the old guard and start new, right? Get all these reformers on board and build something better, build something important. But that did not happen, and as a result, the old people, the old, you know, communist leaders, the communist politicians, they became members of the new government, presidents, premiers, etc., etc. So nothing really changed. In fact, I would say, you know, a lot of people would even say it got worse, right? Because of many different factors. And so government here is definitely a weak point. There's a lot of corruption. I tell to everybody that if you want to, you know, if you're having a good day and you want to ruin your mood, go and read Ukrainian news, and you're going to see a lot of corruption, a lot of things. You know, this guy bought a house here, this person bought a house there. You're going to see that, and that is a big issue, right? That is a big issue. The trust in government is one, but also the fact that what Ukraine needs, in my opinion, is a strong leader. It needs somebody who will enact reforms, who will say, okay, this is what we do, this is what we won't do, who is going to take, you know, who is going to make people accountable, make other members of the government accountable for their actions. Because people really are the same everywhere. It's just some places the governments are more efficient in creating trust, in creating transparency, in doing all of that. Unfortunately, here in Ukraine, this is a big issue, right? Like the problem with corruption, the problem with lack of transparency, all of this, the bureaucracy, the fact that you need to pay somebody to have a job. Like, or if you just graduated, you want to work in a hospital as a doctor, you got to pay somebody. You want to work in this government office, you got to pay somebody, right? You need connections, you need all that. And it's hard to believe in the 21st century there are countries in Europe that are still like that, right? Where you're not being rewarded on your merit and you're being rewarded for your connections. And this is something that the government needs to fix. Because if you think about in Ukraine, you have business. And what does business want to do? Business wants to make money, and they can go out and they can make their money. But the government needs to enable that. They need to create, they need to build the infrastructure, right? Something that I mentioned. They need to build, they need to create a more effective bureaucracy, right? So people can get what they do, what they want. They can get what they need without resorting to bribes, which is just a shortcut, right? All of that needs to be done by the government. Nobody else can do it. Business cannot do it because business only wants to make money. Business cannot do it. The government needs to step in and do it. And unfortunately, in my experience, I mean, things are improving. Things are improving. They are improving. But there's a long way to go of creating a very, very effective government where, you know, the citizens trust their government, which is going to take a very, very long time. And really, that's where it all ends, is that there needs to be somebody who says, okay, this is allowed, this is not allowed. You do it, you're going to get a big fine. You do that, there are going to be consequences for what you want to do. And so these are the 5 things that, in my opinion, keep Ukraine poor. They're kind of linked together. Some are disconnected, some are a little bit different. But for the most part, these 5 things need to be fixed. And then, and only then, Ukraine will have a chance to kind of get better and start, you know, progressing, start improving. And hopefully that's going to be done sooner than later.